It feels like for weeks and maybe even months now, we have been waiting and waiting and waiting for this Orioles offense to explode. Well, on Monday, it finally happened as they clobbered the White Sox in a 13-3 victory. And I'll recap everything you need to know from the Labor Day W coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, September 3rd, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to recap the Orioles' 13-3 victory over the Chicago White Sox on Monday, just bludgeoning one of the worst teams in baseball history, as they should have. We'll talk about the big offensive performances from Austin Slater, Cedric Mullins, and others, and try to break down why Corbin Burnes was better on Monday, but why there are still issues there with the Orioles ace. Then we'll talk about some roster moves, kind of a roster move rundown from the past week. Adrien Houser joining the Orioles on a minor league deal, a guy who could help the team down the stretch. And then some smaller movements on the back ends of the roster as Nick Maton is in Baltimore. Nick Vespi stays in the organization, but Dylan Tate does not. And that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. So we begin this one with a big-time Orioles win. Final score from Monday afternoon at Oriole Park is the O's 13 and the Chicago White Sox 3 in Game 1 of a 3-game set. It is the 11th consecutive loss for the White Sox, which are on track right now to be the worst team in Major League history. Their record now 31-108 on the season. The Orioles on the flip side get to 80 wins, 80-59 on the year. And as I am recording here on Monday evening, the Orioles are back in first place in the AL East. They are tied with the Yankees, and because they currently have the tiebreaker over New York, they are the first place team. But the Yankees are in action 8 o'clock tonight in Texas for the first game of a series against the Rangers. So if the Yankees win, O's will stay a half game back. If the Yankees lose, Orioles will go into Tuesday in first place all by themselves. And I'm going to get you the 5 things you need to know from the Orioles 13-3 win over the White Sox. And the first thing you need to know is Austin Slater had himself not only his best day in an Oriole uniform, but one of the best days of his major league career. Slater in this one was one of the key contributors, going 3 for 4 with 2 singles, a double, a walk, a hit by pitch, and 3 RBIs. He reaches base 5 of the 6 times he came to the plate in the Orioles' big win on Monday, and was actually an interesting time for Slater because up until this point, he had pretty much only started against left-handed pitchers for the Orioles. That's what the O's brought him in to do. It was a very minor trade, him and Livan Soto coming over from the Reds for cash right before the deadline hit. And it was basically a guy who had had a rough year, but in his past had been really good, especially against left-handed pitching. The Orioles needed to get a little bit more right-handed, especially in the outfield, and Slater was a bench bat who helped them do that. And he'd been pretty good against lefties, but never really thrown in there against a right-hander. Well, the Orioles clearly wanted to get Anthony Santander kind of a half day off where he can DH and stay in the lineup. But the way the roster is constructed right now, with Mountcastle out and some of the injuries they're dealing with, you pretty much have to play Slater in the outfield if you're going to DH Anthony Santander. And even with the right-hander Chris Flexen getting the start for the White Sox, Slater was in the lineup batting 7th, and he did not disappoint. Had a single early. His big hit was the 2-run single that was a huge part of the Orioles' 6-run 6, where they really pulled away from the White Sox in this game. And now you can see Slater, who is, wherever he's been, he can play all 3 outfield positions defensively and play them at a pretty high level. He's shown he can hit lefties. Now not the greatest righties he's facing and that terrible White Sox pitching staff, but he's hitting righties. And you look at it all of a sudden, and he's now hitting .295 with an .836 OPS since joining the Orioles. That will play. And with Mullins and Houser and Santander out there, and with the options the Orioles have at designated hitter, Unless there's more injuries, I'm not sure we get to a point this year where Slater is an everyday player, but he's going to be in there every day against lefties. And I wouldn't be surprised if the O's do try to mix him in a little bit more against right-handed starters, because even with the explosion Monday, the O's offense has been struggling. And you got to play anybody who's got the hot hand. And Ramon Arias had the hottest hand. He is now on the injured list. Maybe Slater's the guy with the hottest hand. And you just get him in there and ride that hot hand every day for a week, even if they are facing a right-handed pitcher. Second thing you need to know from this Orioles win, speaking of the outfield, is that Cedric Mullins got in there for a 3-hit day of his own. Orioles had 18 hits in total, only 2 3-hit days, though. That was Austin Slater and Cedric Mullins. Cedric goes 3 for 6 with a double, a home run, and 3 RBIs in this game. His 14th long ball of the year was a 2-run shot in the 8th, got the Orioles to 13 runs. But the big thing for Mullins was he hadn't done this in a while. Now, Mullins had a really great middle of the season. He was struggling in May, and then he kind of turned things back around. He was great in June. He was great in July. It looked like he was turning his season back around just when the Orioles needed him to. And then his August kind of looked like early in the season had looked as well. He hit just 200 with a 641 OPS in the month of August and just started to slump again. Maybe this can break him out. His home run was his first since August 8th, had been almost a month since he went deep. And the 3-hit game was the first 3-hit game for Mullins since June 27th. So this was a big day for Cedric Mullins. Hopefully that can get him going out there in center field, because we know how much he means to the team defensively. He's starting to steal a few more bases recently. Big for the O's offense. And the third thing you need to know from this win is it was just a big day for everybody out there in this Orioles offense. 13 runs on 18 hits for the O's. The 13 runs was their most since June 20th, when they scored 17 in a win at Yankee Stadium. And the 18 hits was the most since the day after that. That was June 21st in Houston, that crazy game the Orioles lost 14-11 against the Astros. They had 18 hits in that one as well. All 9 Orioles starters had a hit. 7 of the 9 had a multi-hit game. And the 2 guys who didn't have multiple hits, one was Gunnar Henderson, who led off the game with a home run against Chris Flexen, gave him 34 homers on the year, and that ties the Orioles' all-time record for single-season home runs by a shortstop. Gunnar, Cal Ripken Jr., and Miguel Tejada, all with 34 homers in a season. Gunnar with 1 more, which he will get, will break that record. And then Anthony Santander, who had an RBI single in this one, is his only hit. Oh, yeah. He also walked 3 times. So he was certainly on base a bunch, just not racking up the hits like some of his teammates. But you just look up and down this lineup. I mean, Adley Rutschman, 2 hits, a walk, and an RBI. That's big for him. He's been struggling. Ryan O'Hearn with a walk and a couple of hits. Colton Cowser left 7 runners on base in his first 3 at-bats. Ended up with hits in the next 2. Also had a walk. That was nice to see. Jackson Holliday with a couple of hits and double. Even Emmanuel Rivera went 2 for 5, including, really the finishing blow of this game was his 2-run triple in the 6th inning, as Rivera just crushed one into the right center field gap. Everybody was contributing. And I thought maybe, 11-3 game in the bottom of the 8th, the Orioles would get some of those players off the bench. They've got some guys who aren't going to play a lot who are on that bench, but Brandon Hyde did not go to any pinch hitters, even with the 8-run lead. And I kind of get it. Right? The O's offense has had so many struggles lately. You're finally putting together this game where everything is clicking for everyone, 1 through 9 in the order. You want to get those guys as many at-bats as possible while they're feeling good to keep that momentum going into the next day and into the rest of this month. So I did like that he kind of kept everybody in there to get some more at-bats late in the game, even with the score being what it was. But for the O's, besides that, 7 for 23 with runners in scoring position. Now you look at that and you first think, oh my gosh, they let up 16 chances. Well, 7 for 23 is a 304 batting average. If you hit 304 with runners in scoring position, you're doing something right. And yeah, the Orioles left a lot of runners on base in the beginning of the game. I believe they left 2 runners on base in each of the first 4 innings. They were adding runs. They had scored 5 runs, but they hadn't broke through. Well, they finally did with the 6-run 6 to finally put it away. Chris Flexen, the White Sox starter, was not very good, but that changeup is still elite, and he made a lot of good pitches to get key strikeouts when he needed to with runners in scoring position. But you know what? The Orioles still got 7 hits with runners in scoring position. And when you're getting that many chances, 23 chances, you're not going to convert on all of them. You're doing something right with that many runners on base. 6 through 9 in the order when a combined 10 for 21 in this game. That was Mullins, Slater, Holiday, and Rivera. Just getting contributions everywhere. And again, 13 runs on only 2, and the 2 long balls were a solo shot and a 2-run shot. 10 of the 13 runs were non-homers. That is huge for the O's offense. Now, the fourth thing you need to know from this one as we turn it to the pitching side, Corbin Burnes, I would say, took a step in the right direction in this one for the Orioles. He has been struggling lately. There is no way to sugarcoat it. It was a really, really bad month of August for Corbin Burnes. He went out there in August and in 5 starts posted a 7.36 ERA. And that is even with, 5, 6, 7 of the runs that he allowed being unearned in the month. And he still had a 7.36 ERA. It was not good, but he took a step in the right direction. 5 innings of 1-run ball, or at least 1 earned run, 2 runs total, on 6 hits with 4 Ks and 1 walk on 89 pitches for Burnes. Number one thing I want to point out, only 3 hard hit balls by the White Sox order against Burnes in 5 innings. That was huge. Really, the first inning was just tough luck. There was some bad defense. Even though the White Sox scored 2 runs, only 1 was earned. A couple of bloop hits made the difference in that inning. Burnes got out of it and then threw 4 consecutive zeros up on the board before coming out of the game because he just wasn't efficient and had thrown 89 pitches in 5 innings. Now, it's going to take longer than I have to dissect Corbin Burnes, and maybe later this week on the podcast, I'll do an even deeper dive into what happened to Burnes in August and what does he need to do moving forward. But some things I noticed in this game, the command was a little better, but he's still not being pitch efficient. He's still not missing bats. And the issues could be a little bit of a lot of things. The stuff, the command, his trust. It's a contract year, so maybe you don't want to make as many changes to mess that up. Maybe it could be stuff at home. I mean, his wife had twins during the season and he's barely been able to be there to be with them. That's going to be putting some stress on him. But the thing is, like when you look at the data on his pitches, the spin, the velocity, the break, they're most of the same as they have ever been. And yet he's just not getting swings and misses, not getting Ks, not missing bats like you're used to from Corbin Burnes. And I think right now, the one thing I noticed the most, besides the fact that his cutter velocity was down almost 2 miles an hour, but the broadcast did say Burnes had said he was doing that on purpose to try to get better command and movement on the cutter. It might have worked a little bit, but the most noticeable thing is Burnes has 5 pitches. And right now it looks like he only trusts himself to throw his cutter and his curveball consistently for strikes. Now, at times in his career, the cutter and curveball have been Burnes' 2 best pitches and 2 nastiest pitches. But I don't know if that's the case right now. And if you look at his stuff, it feels like the slider, the sinker, and the changeup are actually nastier. But he doesn't trust those pitches for himself to throw them for strikes. He threw 20 combined changeups and sinkers in this game. Only 2 of them ended up in the strike zone. That's just non-competitive pitches, despite the movement and the filth on those 2 offerings. So he's got to find a way to command those pitches a little bit better, because when he gets behind in the count, he's only throwing cutter curveball and he's getting behind in counts more than ever. That's making him a 2-pitch pitcher. And even Corbin Burnes with 2 pitches becomes much more hittable. That is a lot of what I've seen. I think he really needs to work on changeup, sinker, slider, command, find one more pitch of those 3 he can throw consistently for a strike. And I think we'll get back to what we're used to from Corbin Burnes. And the 5th and final thing you need to know from the Orioles' 13-3 win over the White Sox on Monday afternoon is that Cole Irvin got his 2nd career save and his 1st with the Orioles. Now, a little bit of a weird Major League Baseball rule. If you pitch 3 or more innings to finish a win in a game, you are credited with a save no matter what the score is. And that is what Cole Irvin did. Keegan Aiken replaced Burnes in the 6th through a 1-2-3 inning. Then the Orioles got the 6-run 6th. They made it 11-3 at that point, or 11-2, I should say, and they went to Irvin. And Irvin was good in long relief, finished the game 3 innings, 1 run on 2 hits, 2 Ks and no walks on 43 pitches with 0 hard hit balls against the Oriole left-hander. And it's kind of an interesting spot for Irvin. I mean, he was pitching in the lowest leverage possible, but I did want to bring it up because Sunday in Colorado would have been Irvin's turn to start again. He started last Tuesday in LA, but of course the Orioles were able to activate Zach Eflin off the injured list Sunday. He's been your best starter for a while. He was amazing. And so Irvin kind of got pushed back, kind of got knocked out of the rotation. We're not really sure because had Dean Kramer been okay, Irvin would have been out of the rotation. But Kramer gets hit in the wrist by that line drive early in his start on Saturday. And although he has not gone on the injured list yet, which is certainly a good sign, he hasn't thrown yet. The Orioles are hoping that he will try to play catch here on Tuesday, and then they'll go from there. Brandon Hyde, the way he's talking, seems to think that Kramer will at least miss one start after being hit by that liner. X-rays were negative, though, which is the best news with Dean Kramer. But you're not really sure what they're going to do with Irvin. He's still on the roster. And so because he would have probably pitched Sunday or Monday, and they still may need him this weekend, if Dean Kramer can't go, at least in his regular spot, which would be Friday, they're going to need Irvin either Friday or Saturday this weekend against the Rays to at least fill in one more time for Dean Kramer. So you want him to get some work. So this ended up being the perfect time. You throw 3 innings on Monday. You're still very, very available to, on Saturday, start a baseball game. And you don't get a full start. You only throw 43 pitches, but it's a good amount of work in a game scenario. So it doesn't perfectly tell us what Irvin's role is right now, but it is good for keeping him in rhythm just in case the O's do need him to start a game against Tampa this weekend. But pitching, hitting, it all seemingly went well for this Orioles win against, to be fair, the worst team in baseball. But you got to win these games to stay on pace in the American League East, and that is what the Orioles did. But there are also some O's roster moves to get to from the last couple of days, and we will get to those, starting with another potential pitching depth piece in Adrien Houser joining Baltimore. Give you his scouting report coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Now, you know Game Time and their amazing deals on tickets. Well, Game Time now has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Now, this week, big week for the O's, White Sox and Rays coming in for the second to last homestand of the regular season, and you're going to want to get those Orioles tickets over at Game Time. My favorite feature is that you can buy the tickets on Utah Street right before the game and go into the ballpark with the ticket sent right to the app on your phone. It's that easy. They've also got their lowest price guarantee. If it's not, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So even with the very convincing Orioles win over the White Sox on Monday, this is a team that is still dealing with a lot of injuries. And that means they need to keep adding depth. And they did some more of that over the weekend as the Orioles signed right-handed pitcher Adrien Houser to a minor league deal. Now, Houser got into the organization before September 1st, so he could potentially be playoff eligible if the Orioles got down the road and really needed him. But right now he's in AAA Norfolk and is providing some both starting and relief pitching depth for the Orioles. Now, who is Adrien Houser? Well, he is a 31-year-old right-handed pitcher who's been in the big leagues really full-time since 2019 and been a starter and a long reliever. Now, in 2021, he was with the Brewers and had an amazing season that year in 21. Made 26 starts and 142 innings, had a 3.22 ERA, was a huge part of that Brewers rotation alongside of Corbin Burnes. He was like a really, really strong number 4 man behind Burnes and Woodruff and Freddie Peralta that season. But after that in Milwaukee, the next year, he wasn't as good. 2023, he was still solid, but the Brewers did not bring him back, and they traded him to the Mets this offseason. Now, the Mets were hoping they were getting like a solid number 5 starter to put at the end of their rotation, but it didn't really work out. The strikeouts have tanked. The walks went way up this year with the Mets. He made 7 starts, 23 appearances total in 69 and a third innings, had a 5.84 ERA with a 4.93 FIP with New York. And as I mentioned, just a 15% strikeout rate to a 10% walk rate. That is certainly not going to work. Still getting ground balls at a 49% rate. That's the usual Adrien Houser with his sinker. That's a really good ground ball rate, but that's kind of all that's been really good for Houser at least at the big league level this year. Now, the Mets ended up releasing him around the trade deadline as they added some arms, and he signed with the Cubs on a minor league deal on August 6th. And the Cubs put him in their AAA rotation, and he was pretty solid in 4 AAA starts with Chicago, had a 3.86 ERA, but again, really wasn't striking anybody out. And he ended up getting released by the Cubs. They did not plan to bring him to the big league. So the O's signed him to just give him some depth. And here's a good thing. Houser, on one hand, can be starting pitching depth. And with all the starters, the Orioles just seemingly continue to lose to injury. It is never a bad thing to have another guy who has a whole bunch of major league starting experience. When you look at Adrian Houser, he's made 104 starts in the big leagues, and some of them with really good success. That is great to have in AAA just in case you need it. But also on the relief pitching side, quietly, once the Mets, he really struggled in the rotation for the Mets this year. He had an 8.55 ERA in his 7 starts. So once they moved him into the bullpen, now it was in a fairly low leverage role, but he was quietly really good as a reliever. They put Houser in the pen, and in 35 2/3 innings, he had a 3.28 ERA as a relief pitcher. So clearly he was a little bit more comfortable in that role. Now, again, it was much lower leverage. He was a long guy. He was a mop-up guy. But it's still helpful to have a guy who can eat some innings and have some success. Now, again, he's been an extreme ground ball pitcher, but he used to avoid hard contact. That has kind of stopped this year. That's been one of his big issues. He's a heavy sinker usage guy who also has a slider, a changeup, a four-seamer, and a curveball. He hasn't thrown his changeup a lot, although metrically it could be his best pitch if thrown right. We know the Orioles love a changeup. So I think if the O's are going to try to change something and turn him into something, they make him kind of a sinker, changeup, slider guy. But at the very least, the Orioles bring him in to have his depth. They say, go be yourself. And if we need you for a spot start in September or something just to get through the rest of the season, we have you there as depth. Best case scenario, the Orioles call him up and he becomes a really good long man. At worst, he stays in AAA the rest of the year and is just break glass in case of emergency to have another depth starter. And it's always nice to have a guy like Houser in there, who's, again, has started over 100 big league games, and you can go to and know he'll at least be able to handle himself out there if we need another emergency starter. And listen, the O's are trying to get some guys back, but with all their injury bad luck, you just never know. It's better to be safe than sorry and bring in someone on a cheap, no-risk minor league deal like Adrien Houser. But that was not the only moves that the Orioles made over the weekend. They actually made a lot more roster moves. We got a lot more roster news about some injured players. So I'm just going to kind of do a pretty quick rundown, hit on all the Orioles news, moves, and notes from the weekend. That is to finish off the pod coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Now, you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel. It's America's #1 sportsbook. It's the place where I'm checking it out. We got Ravens Chiefs Thursday night to open up the NFL season, and I'm just thinking, I trust Lamar Jackson. Maybe a little Ravens money line no matter what, but they also have something a little different for you at FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. You truly can't beat that deal to watch the NFL this season. And just visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. So for the O's, a few more roster moves, roster news, roster notes to get to before we finish off this episode. And let's start at the top. The Orioles made one more move to add to their active roster. That was before Monday's game, and the veteran infielder Nick Maton was called up for the Orioles. David Banuelos was DFA'd to make room for Maton. Banuelos, the third catcher who was only on the roster on Sunday because the Orioles kind of late before the game placed Ramon Arias on the IL after he sprained his ankle. And Banuelos was already there with the Orioles as the taxi squad catcher. So they've done this a couple of times over the last few years. You get a late injury, you just activate the taxi squad catcher to make sure you're not playing a player down. And then the very next day you DFA him and you get somebody up there who might help you a little bit more on your bench. And for now, Nick Maton is going to be the guy. Now, Maton was up for a few days in June with the Orioles this year after he came over on waivers this offseason, has been in AAA Norfolk for most of the year, almost made the team out of spring training, was one of the final cuts, but never gotten one game, never got a plate appearance in that little stretch in June. That was back when Jordan Westburg got run into by Juan Soto and missed a couple of days. But Maton, a 27-year-old left-handed hitter who's a true utility man, plays second base, shortstop, third base, left field, and right field, can play all around the diamond. Spent parts of 21, 22, and 2023 in the big leagues with both the Phillies and the Tigers, and has been pretty good in AAA Norfolk this year. 330 plate appearances for the Tides for Nick Maton. He's got 16 homers, slashing 261, 368, 477. That's a 119 WRC plus. Good walk rate, not a bad strikeout rate, had an 878 OPS in the month of August in AAA, so was swinging the bat well, kind of deserved this call-up. And basically, Nick Maton joins this group along with Emmanuel Rivera and Kobe Mayo and Levon Soto, who are all on this Orioles roster right now, with the rosters expanding to give you a spot for another hitter on Sunday, and basically just saying, hey, Jordan Westburg and Ramon Arias are both on the injured list. We need to find a way to fill in the third base position until one or both of them hopefully return at some point in September. And between these four guys, with Maton being added to the list, I am confident Brandon Hyde will mix and match. He will find the right matchups. He will play the hot hand, and he will make it a way for that position to be somewhat productive for the O's. Maton just gives the O's another option there. Plus, with the ability to play a lot of positions, he's a good guy to have at the end of your bench. Now, I mentioned David Banuelos had to be added to the roster on Sunday just to make sure the O's weren't playing a player down. Well, Banuelos also had to get on the 40-man roster, and to do that, the Orioles DFA'd Forrest Wall. Now, if you're wondering who is Forrest Wall, well, he hasn't really been with the team for that long. Wall, an outfielder who was claimed off waivers from the Marlins last week, left-handed hitting outfielder with good speed, plays good defense, spent most of his career with the Braves, then on the Marlins for a little bit. Wall was basically claimed, and I talked about it last week, to be a pinch runner in the postseason. With Jorge Mateo now officially out for the rest of the season after getting elbow surgery, Wall could have been that guy if the Orioles want to carry strictly a pinch runner on the playoff roster. Forrest Wall could be that guy. He's got 90th percentile sprint speed, according to StatCast. Now, if he clears waivers, he might stay in the organization, but there's also the chance that the O's just don't carry a guy like that. They didn't do it last year. There's only so many roster spots. He was more of a guy just to have in case, so it wasn't a big deal that they DFA'd him because they had to make kind of an emergency roster move on Sunday. Now, to get Forrest Wall on the roster last week, the Orioles sadly designated Dylan Tate for assignment. Now, we talked about Tate. He had been really Brandon Hyde's most reliable reliever for 2 seasons, and then just had that weird elbow and forearm issues and missed the entirety of the 2023 season for the O's. Returned this year and had some effectiveness in both a couple of stints at the big league level and was pretty good in his time in AAA Norfolk, but Tate just never regained his velocity. He was throwing 95 with the sinker before. He's just kind of been 91 to 92, and the sinker has just been less effective at that velocity. And Tate is due to be a free agent after the 2025 season anyway. He runs out of options after this year. I think the O's saw the writing on the wall that we were probably going to get rid of Dylan Tate this offseason. So they tried to just sneak him through waivers this time. Unfortunately, it did not work. The big reason why is Tate has options, so it's much easier for another team to claim him because they can just stash him into AAA immediately. And the unfortunate part was a division rival picked up Dylan Tate. The Toronto Blue Jays claimed Dylan Tate on waivers and sent him to AAA Buffalo. We shall see if Tate gets to the majors with the Jays this year. Maybe he works on some things this offseason and joins the Jays bullpen next year. They do need a little bit of help in that pen, especially after trading away some arms. The first time, if he stays with the Jays, that he pitches against the Orioles in a Blue Jays uniform will be really tough to watch. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Hopefully he ends up with another team, maybe back with the O's before next season. But Dylan Tate, at least for now, is a Toronto Blue Jay. And what that also means is Dean Kramer is the last guy still around from the players the Orioles acquired from the fire sale at the 2018 trade deadline. Now, while Dylan Tate did not clear waivers, Nick Vespi did. He was DFA'd last week, but he will stay in AAA Norfolk, just not on the 40-man roster. We'll see. The Orioles now have to decide if they want to bring Vespi back next year on a minor league deal with none of his options remaining. He's been the ultimate up-down guy for the last 3 seasons. I kind of hope for Vespi's sake, he catches on with another team in 2025, just maybe someone that'll give him more of a runway if he does deserve it to get some big league bullpen time. The Orioles also released Jean Segura, the veteran infielder who the O's had signed to a minor league deal on August 9th. That was shortly after the Westberg injury. Segura had been in Norfolk and had not been very good, was hitting just 137 for the Tides. Now, Rakabaka reported that Segura actually asked to be released. That means one of two things. Either he wants another opportunity with another team that might get him to the big leagues faster, or he just wants to retire. Segura was not playing anywhere professionally all year until the Orioles signed him in August. So most people had kind of assumed he was heading towards retirement anyway. It's been a long and pretty solid big league career for Jean Segura with multiple teams. That may be it for him in professional baseball. We shall see, but he is no longer a depth infield option for the O's. Now to get to the injuries to finish this off, Jacob Webb, who has been out for a little while with an elbow issue for the Orioles. He started a rehab assignment at AAA Norfolk on Sunday, faced 3 batters, fly out, walk, and double play. His velocity was normal, which was really good. Brandon Hyde said on Monday, Webb will throw at least one more rehab outing in AAA Norfolk, and then the O's will kind of decide from there. So best case scenario, I mean, Webb could rejoin the Orioles this weekend for the series against the Rays. That would be huge. I would probably target next week for Jacob Webb's return, but that is still really good news for a guy who's, not your best or second best reliever, but was a really, really solid, reliable bullpen contributor all season. It would be a huge boost for the middle relief part of this Orioles pen. Speaking of relievers in the pen, Danny Coulomb is throwing. Not throwing bullpens yet, but is throwing, as is Grayson Rodriguez. He is throwing as well. Both have been out on the injured list. The Orioles are expecting to get both of them back at some point in September. So the fact that they're throwing is a good timeline for those two guys. Jordan Westberg is continuing to do drills without his broken hand. Still not a full timetable on him. Ryan Mountcastle also without a timetable. Brandon Hyde said he had no idea about Mountcastle's timetable after he jammed his wrist. He still has not swung a bat. So this seems like it's going to be a little bit longer injury for Mountcastle than we initially thought. No further updates on Ramon Arias with that sprained ankle. The only one on Dean Kramer is, as I mentioned, they are going to plan to have him try to play catch here on Tuesday and then go from there as the swelling continues to come down after being hit on the wrist by that line drive. And finally, the Baltimore Banner has reported that Heston Kjerstad, dealing with those concussion issues, is hoping to start a rehab assignment around September 10th. That is a week from now. And then you're thinking you give him at least a week or two to come back. So maybe in late September, maybe the Orioles could add Kjerstad as a big left-handed bat, at least to this bench, to give a little upgrade to the lineup. But again, concussions are nothing to mess around with. You want to make sure he is fully 110% healthy before putting Kjerstad back out there. Whew, those are a lot of injury and news updates, but you know how I like to talk roster moves and injury updates and all that good stuff on this podcast. The O's are getting slightly healthier. It's a slow burn, but they're getting there. And hopefully day by day, they get closer and closer to getting some of these key contributors back as they make their playoff run and they make their run towards a division title. And they continue that run on Tuesday. Sometimes it's just really, really nice to play the worst team in baseball. And that's what the Orioles will continue on Tuesday. It's the White Sox at 6:35. Cade Povich, who was not very good against the Dodgers his last time out, but an easier opponent in Chicago on Tuesday night. He will go up against the 24-year-old right-hander Nick Nastrini, who has a 7.04 ERA in 7 starts for the White Sox, although he was really good his last time out against Texas, 6 innings of 1 run ball. We'll see what the O's can do against him. And then I'll be back on Wednesday recapping game 2 between the O's and the Sox and maybe diving a little bit more into the current situation with Corbin Burnes. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.